When is it, how can it be, when is it moral to use violence to prevent greater evil? Say you are a Christian bishop living in the 4th century in what today is northeastern Algeria. You live at the edge of an empire whose enemies are not far away. And let's say that a raiding party of these enemies comes through the neighborhood, and for the sake of argument, because this is like the philosophy class version of this question, they knock on your door and they explain, Bishop Augustine, who would go on to be St. Augustine, we want to let you know we won't be attacking you today, but we will be going next door to kill your neighbors. And off they go. Augustine looks at his own sword sitting in the corner and all his friends and relatives nearby who have theirs, and knows that he could stop these bandits. He knows also that if he picked up the sword and killed these attackers, it would be a sin. He's a Christian bishop, so sin is the language of that time for moral evil. But then again, as the saying goes, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. So surely it can't be moral for him to take no action to prevent a preventable atrocity. Augustine reasons that when a terrible evil can only be stopped by violence, it's not just allowable, but a moral necessity. Now, he writes this 1600 years ago, beginning a long conversation among philosophers and theologians about what makes war just, a conversation which in a little bit I'm going to disagree with pretty vehemently. But for the moment, he writes this. He says, "They who have waged war in obedience to divine command have represented in their persons the public justice or wisdom of the government," they have the right authority, "and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" I'll let that sit for a minute. Okay. There's a little bit of bracketing we have to do here. So we're going to pause on the obvious problem of making war in obedience to divine command. There's so much problematic about that. We're going to throw that out for a minute and consider instead, maybe sharper, more pointedly, the failure of anyone to do anything whatsoever to intervene in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. In a little more than 3 months, 750,000 ethnic Tutsis were killed. And our country, this country, certainly had the power to intervene, certainly could have used violence, but a much smaller amount of violence to stop a much greater one, and we let it happen. When and how is it moral to use force to protect someone else? Surely there must be times. In 1859, 6 men financed, in fact, 5 Unitarians, 2 of them ministers, and another financed a raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry by the abolitionist John Brown, who was going to seize those weapons, arm slaves in the South, and begin a general revolt. I cannot believe that in 1859, the freedom of enslaved people could have been won through a nonviolent appeal to conscience. Memorial Day itself, founded in 1868, was to honor Union soldiers who died fighting. So, okay, I'm saying this in a way, trying to make, or at least invite, maybe Augustine's reasoning can sometimes feel intuitively true when a terrible evil can only be stopped by violence. Maybe it is morally allowable. And the philosophers who have written and wrestled on this question over these last 16 centuries ask, okay, if this is true, then when and how? They say that for war to be just, you need compelling and coherent answers to big questions. Why is the war being fought? When is a state compelled or permitted to use force? How is that force used during combat. And for these philosophers, the why of war means a state can only undertake aggression if it meets 4 criteria: just cause, like the defense of innocent life, Augustine's neighbors; just cause, like the prevention of large-scale systematic violation of human rights, like the Civil War, say; or just cause, like restoring the conditions of decent human existence. So John Brown's raid to incite a slave rebellion was about that. They say, okay, if you have just cause, you also need proper authority. For Augustine, proper authority was easy because God said it was okay. Slightly more complicated in international relations in the 20th century. Today, people tend to mean the consent of the international community or the community of states to be affected by the arena of war. A third criteria is that it needs to reasonably be the last resort of the state. Augustine can't just run over and start killing people. He needs at least to say, stop, don't murder my neighbors first before doing that. And finally, even if all of these conditions are true, the writers say a war is only just if there's a real possibility of success. Strong reason to believe that the peace which will result from the war will be better than if no one went to war in the first place. It's a little bit more philosophy. Stick with me for a sec, because just war also requires certain behavior during conflict. A distinction between soldiers and civilians, proportionality that only harms civilians in proportion to the importance of the military objective. Violence can only serve legitimate military objectives. There has to be fair treatment of prisoners and no evil means, atrocities, uncontrollable weapons. And on the one hand, I think these rules are lovely and clean and make a lot of sense and do not describe how the world actually operates. It is straightforward and short. There is a requirement to go to war: just cause, proper authority, last resort, possibility of success. It is practical and intuitive. Behavior in war, the distinction of soldier and civilian, proportionality of harm, military necessity, fair treatment. In that list, I hear a reasonable and practical set of limits on violence. And also, with every bit of that list, as I dig through it, as I say it, as I read the words on this page, I hear the distance getting larger and larger from the catastrophe and atrocity which is always and inevitably warfare. Distinction, proportionality, fair treatment, each of those is a step back away from broken bodies, bleeding and burning buildings, last resort, proper authority. The discussion is thick, and the actual violence is far over the horizon now, away from us who think about this coolly and dispassionately. Proper authority and just cause combat is a dream, a distance, an idea, not a fact. Because however clear the philosophy of the just war might be, the further away from the horrifying fact of violence, the easier it is to delude ourselves about what's going on. Augustine says this himself with a perfectly clear absurdity, our own capacity to delude ourselves. He writes, this is a verbatim quote, translated, but quote, "The wise man will wage just wars, for if they were not just, he would not wage them." This is my dog's "if you didn't want me to eat that chicken, you wouldn't have left it on the counter" defense. It must have been left for me because it was on the counter and I ate it. The wise man will wage just wars, for if they were not just, he would not wage them. Which feels so obviously ridiculous when Augustine writes it a millennia and a half ago. these are the same stories that we tell ourselves too. It's moral disengagement in the disguise of reason. Moral disengagement is an attempt to deactivate and disengage your internal moral controls. It's like putting the car in neutral, right? The moral engine spins, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's not connected to anything. Moral disengagement takes the form of a logical and reasonable argument. Now there is a part of you hearing any news report on the war in Gaza, the starvation, the destruction, the death. There is a still small voice in you that says, this is clearly absurd and inhumane. Just like there's a part of you hearing the atrocities of the October 7th attacks on Israel, the randomness of murdering civilians, which said, this is clearly a horror for which there cannot be justification. But then comes the voice of moral disengagement, trying to overrule the voice of conscience. Surely, it says, surely those good, practical, fair, true, ethical standards we all agree on, surely they don't apply here. And it's difficult to say this without sort of dripping venom, but this is at the heart of arguments made every day by politicians and pundits. It goes like this. Of course we believe in not harming civilians. Of course, everybody believes, of course. Of course we're good people. Of course we don't want that to happen. Of course families in a war zone shouldn't starve while the hospitals are bombed. Everybody knows that. We don't disagree. It's just that in this particular situation, other things are more important. Nor is it just the violence of Israel's military where I hear that sort of a justification. I hear, of course the Hamas murders on October, of course they were, everybody knows they were terrible. No one is thinking they're a good thing. But in this situation, after everything that Israel has done for generations, what else could they have done? Moral justification means you reconstrue problematic behaviors as acceptable because they ultimately achieve a noble or desirable goal. So they must be acceptable. The war is just because a just person wages it. This is Mary Grace Anthony, a researcher on how we talk, especially about refugees and migrants. And she goes on to say that hand in hand with moral justification is euphemistic labeling, using strategic linguistic devices to disguise or conceal reprehensible behavior, making them sound innocuous, less harmful, less despicable. For instance, collateral damage. Reports that a threat has been neutralized, rather than detailing the brutal reality that human beings were killed. And finally, she says, this last piece of moral disengagement, along with justification and labeling to create distance, is advantageous comparison. It makes undesirable behavior seem benign because of what the alternative would be. And I've heard that. Hamas seeks the total destruction of Israel, says Netanyahu. Surely, he says with sarcasm, surely the partial destruction of Gaza is better than the total destruction of Israel. It's easy to get trapped by that and start into the argument of it, right? But I don't want us to get hooked by that. Instead, each of these, moral justification and euphemistic labeling and advantageous comparison, they're strategies to turn off your moral brain under the guise of reason. They say your ordinary way of thinking, of feeling about the morality of war, it's fine, it just doesn't apply to this war. And there are reasons and justifications and explanations, all presented in a form that asks for a rational answer back, that makes it hard for you to say, I know this is wrong, even if I don't know what right looks like here. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr writes that reason is the servant of impulse before it is its master, which is to say our faculty of reason, our ability to think about cause and effect and relationships, about whether evidence adds up. It's not that that is a bad or broken or compromised thing. It's not that that is hopelessly suspect. And it is the servant of impulse before it is its master. It's easier to find why a war is just once you've already decided that it is just. Whatever merit the just war tradition might have in theory, in practice, arguments about just cause and proportionality and the distinctions of soldier and civilian are weaponized in the service of moral disengagement to disconnect you from the love, the compassion, the essential humanity at the center of your values, and trap you into reasonable-sounding logical arguments that don't go anywhere. We argue over who did what, when, and how much violence is enough and too much instead of simply saying, this is wrong. And you don't need an answer or an alternative or a solution before you say it. You don't need to analyze or judge or weigh the alternatives. This is wrong. Give up the world, says the poet. Give up self, give up God. Pair your beliefs, your absolutes. Make it simple, make it clean. Keep this and only this, what your heart beats loudly for. What feels heavy and full in your gut. There will only be one or two things you keep, and they will fit lightly in your pocket. Reason in the service of compassion, and never without conscience. It fits lightly. Hold it close. Nothing but peace is enough. Amen.